I never thought I'd be telling this story. 6 months ago, I was just another 34-year-old woman living what I thought was a perfectly normal life in Riverside, Oregon. My name is Anne, and I worked as a graphic designer from home, spending my days creating marketing materials for local businesses, while my husband David finished his nursing degree at the community college. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We'd been married for 8 years, and I thought I knew everything about the man I'd fallen in love with during my college years. I was wrong about so many things. The symptoms started gradually, so subtly that I almost didn't notice them at first. It began with occasional nausea in the mornings, which I initially attributed to stress from a particularly demanding client project. Then came the fatigue that seemed to creep deeper into my bones each day, making it harder to concentrate on my work. My hands would shake when I tried to use my graphics tablet, and I'd find myself staring at the computer screen for minutes at a time, unable to remember what I was supposed to be doing. David was incredibly supportive during those early weeks. He'd bring me chamomile tea when the nausea was particularly bad, rub my shoulders when the tension headaches struck, and constantly suggest that maybe I should take a break from work to focus on my health. His concern felt genuine, loving even. He'd stroke my hair as I lay on the couch, whispering that everything would be okay, that we'd figure out what was wrong. Looking back now, those moments of tenderness feel like poison themselves. By the 3rd month, the symptoms had escalated beyond anything I could ignore or rationalize away. The nausea became so severe that I could barely keep food down, and I'd lost nearly 15 pounds from my already slender frame. My skin took on a grayish pallor that made me look like I was slowly fading away. The fatigue was overwhelming, leaving me bedridden for hours at a time. Worst of all were the episodes of confusion and memory loss that would strike without warning. I'd find myself in the middle of a conversation with a client, completely unable to remember what we'd been discussing. Once I discovered I'd been staring at a blank document for over an hour, with no recollection of sitting down at my computer. The medical appointments became a constant rotation of specialists and tests. Our family doctor, Dr. Harrison, ran blood work that came back normal except for some minor vitamin deficiencies. He referred me to a gastroenterologist when the digestive issues persisted, but the colonoscopy and endoscopy revealed nothing unusual. The neurologist I saw for the memory problems ordered an MRI that showed a perfectly healthy brain. Each negative result felt like another door closing, another dead end in what was becoming a terrifying medical mystery. David accompanied me to every appointment, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions about potential treatments. He researched my symptoms online, printing out articles about rare conditions and dietary supplements that might help. His dedication to finding answers impressed every doctor we saw. More than once, medical professionals commented on how lucky I was to have such a caring, attentive husband. If only they knew the truth. The financial strain of constant medical bills began affecting our daily life. My work suffered as I became too sick to meet deadlines, and several clients terminated their contracts with me. David had to increase his hours at the hospital where he was completing his clinical rotations, often working double shifts to cover our expenses. He never complained, never made me feel guilty for the burden my illness was placing on our finances. Instead, he'd come home exhausted from his shifts and immediately focus on taking care of me, preparing meals I could tolerate, and managing my medications. It was during this period that I began to notice small inconsistencies that my sick brain initially dismissed. Sometimes I'd feel slightly better on days when David was at school or work for extended periods, only to feel worse again after he returned home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The vitamins he'd started giving me to address my deficiencies sometimes made me feel nauseated rather than energized. When I mentioned these observations to him, he had reasonable explanations. My energy levels naturally fluctuated throughout the day. The vitamins were high dose and could cause stomach upset if not taken with enough food. His logic always made sense, and I trusted him completely. The turning point came on a particularly difficult Tuesday in late September. I'd been feeling somewhat better that morning, managing to complete a small design project for the first time in weeks. David had left early for clinical rotations at the hospital and wouldn't be back until evening. For the first time in months, I felt almost like myself again. I was sitting at my desk, actually enjoying the creative process, when I heard the front door open much earlier than expected. David appeared in my office doorway, looking surprised to see me working. He explained that his clinical supervisor had sent him home early due to a scheduling mix-up. But something about his expression seemed off. There was a tension around his eyes that I'd never noticed before, a tightness in his smile that didn't reach his gaze. He quickly moved to the kitchen, saying he'd prepare my afternoon medications and a snack since I was feeling well enough to work. Within an hour of his return, the familiar waves of nausea and confusion had returned with a vengeance. I had to abandon my project and retreat to bed, feeling frustrated and defeated. As I lay there fighting off another bout of severe stomach cramping, a terrible thought crept into my mind. The timing seemed too coincidental. I felt better when he was gone, and worse when he returned. But the idea was so horrific, so unthinkable, that I immediately pushed it away. This was David, the man who loved me, who was sacrificing his own well-being to care for me. The very suggestion that he could be involved in my illness felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about our marriage. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the following days I found myself paying closer attention to patterns I'd previously ignored. I started keeping a simple journal, noting my symptoms and energy levels throughout each day. The correlation became impossible to ignore. My worst episodes consistently occurred after David had been home for several hours. The meals he prepared with such loving care often preceded my most severe bouts of nausea. The medications he carefully organized and administered seemed to coincide with my periods of greatest confusion and fatigue. The realization that I needed to investigate my own husband felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss of uncertainty. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my safety in my own home was suddenly in question. I began to understand why victims of domestic abuse often struggle to leave their situations. When the person you trust most in the world becomes a source of potential danger, your entire sense of reality crumbles. I knew I needed evidence before I could act on my suspicions. Accusations without proof would be dismissed as paranoid delusions brought on by my illness. I needed to document what was happening in my home when I was too sick to pay attention. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I needed cameras. The online research into hidden camera systems felt like entering a world I'd never imagined needing to know about. There were dozens of options, from tiny devices disguised as everyday objects to more sophisticated systems that could stream footage directly to cloud storage. I settled on a set of 3 small cameras that looked like standard electrical outlets, phone chargers, and a digital clock. The reviews emphasized their excellent video quality and motion detection capabilities, exactly what I needed to monitor my home environment when I was too sick to be aware of my surroundings. Ordering the cameras required careful planning. I couldn't risk David seeing the package or the charges on our shared credit card. I used a prepaid card I'd purchased during a rare solo trip to the grocery store and had the package delivered to our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, explaining that I was planning a surprise for David and needed to keep the delivery secret. Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher in her 70s, was delighted to be part of what she assumed was a romantic gesture. If only she knew the real reason for my secrecy. Installing the cameras proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. My illness made it difficult to focus for extended periods, and I had to work in short bursts when David was at school or clinical rotations. The outlet camera went into our bedroom wall, positioned to capture the area around my nightstand where David prepared my evening medications. The clock camera sat on our kitchen counter, angled to record the food preparation area. The phone charger camera plugged into an outlet in our living room, where I spent most of my waking hours on the couch. Setting up the cloud storage and mobile app took several attempts. My illness-addled brain struggled with the technical aspects, and I had to rest frequently to combat the waves of nausea and confusion that struck without warning. But determination kept me going. I needed to know what was happening to me. I needed to reclaim some sense of control over my life and my health. The first few days of recording yielded nothing unusual. I watched hours of footage showing David preparing meals with apparent care, organizing my medications with methodical precision, and tending to me with what looked like genuine affection. I began to wonder if my suspicions were indeed the paranoid delusions of a sick mind. Maybe the timing of my symptoms was purely coincidental. Maybe I was so desperate for answers that I was creating conspiracies where none existed. But I continued monitoring, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I had no other leads to pursue. The medical community had exhausted their diagnostic abilities, and my symptoms continued to worsen despite various treatments. If the cameras couldn't provide answers, I was running out of options for understanding what was destroying my health. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in early October. I'd been having one of my better days, managing to complete a small freelance project and even preparing dinner for myself while David was at his evening clinical rotation. I felt more like my old self than I had in months, with clear thinking and steady energy levels. When David returned home around 8 o'clock, I was sitting on the couch reading a novel, something I hadn't been able to do for weeks. He seemed pleased to see me looking better, but mentioned that I should still take my evening medications to maintain my improvement. As always, he prepared everything himself, bringing me a glass of water and the small collection of pills and vitamins that had become part of my daily routine. I took them without question, as I had hundreds of times before, and David settled beside me on the couch to watch television. Within 30 minutes, the familiar symptoms returned with devastating intensity. Nausea hit me like a physical blow, followed by waves of dizziness that made it impossible to focus on the television screen. My hands began to shake, and a peculiar metallic taste filled my mouth. David helped me to bed, expressing concern about this sudden decline after such a promising day. He suggested that maybe I had pushed myself too hard and needed more rest. The next morning, I immediately checked the camera footage from the previous evening. What I saw changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my life. The kitchen camera had captured David's medication preparation routine with perfect clarity. Instead of simply organizing the pills prescribed by my doctors, the footage showed him carefully opening several capsules and adding a white powdery substance from a small vial he kept hidden behind the coffee maker. He worked with the precision of someone who had performed this task many times before, measuring the powder carefully before recapsulating the medications. I watched the footage 3 times, hoping I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. But there was no mistaking David's deliberate actions. He was adding something to my medications, something that wasn't prescribed by any doctor. The loving, caring husband, who had held my hair back while I vomited, who had sacrificed his time and energy to care for me, was systematically poisoning me. The emotional impact of this discovery was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible, not just because David was harming me, but because he was doing it while maintaining a facade of love and concern. Every gentle touch, every worried expression, every sacrifice he'd made for my care had been part of an elaborate deception. The man I'd trusted with my life was slowly killing me, and he was doing it with such skill that even medical professionals had been fooled. My first instinct was to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for what I'd witnessed. But a small voice of self-preservation held me back. If David was capable of poisoning me for months while pretending to love me, what might he do if he knew I discovered his secret? I needed to be smart about this, to gather more evidence and find a way to protect myself before revealing what I knew. I spent the next several days in a state of hypervigilance, pretending to be the same trusting wife while internally cataloging every suspicious behavior. David's bedside manner now seemed sinister rather than caring. His detailed questions about my symptoms felt like a scientist monitoring his experiment rather than a husband worried about his wife. The way he insisted on preparing all my food and medications took on a darker significance. I began to understand how thoroughly he had isolated me, creating a situation where I was completely dependent on him for my basic needs. The cameras continued to record, and the evidence mounted. I watched David tamper with my medications multiple times, always using the same careful technique to add the mysterious powder. He varied the dosage, which explained why my symptoms fluctuated in severity. Sometimes he added nothing at all, creating the better days that had given me hope for recovery. I realized he was probably calibrating the amount to keep me sick, but not sick enough to require hospitalization, where blood tests might reveal the presence of toxins. Research into potential substances that could cause my symptoms led me down a dark rabbit hole of information about poisoning methods. Many common household chemicals and even some readily available medications could cause the constellation of symptoms I'd been experiencing when administered in small, regular doses. David's nursing education would have given him access to information about drug interactions and toxic effects. His clinical rotations provided opportunities to obtain substances that might not be easily traceable. The psychological toll of maintaining my normal routine while knowing the truth was enormous. I had to pretend to trust David, to accept his care and concern as genuine, while knowing he was slowly killing me. I had to continue taking the medications he prepared, knowing they contained poison, because any change in my behavior might alert him to my discovery. The only way I could protect myself was to document everything while appearing to be the same naive victim he thought he was controlling. Sleep became impossible. How could I close my eyes next to someone who was systematically destroying my health? I'd lie awake listening to David's breathing, wondering what had driven him to this level of betrayal. Was it insurance money? Did he have someone else he wanted to be with? Had I done something to deserve this treatment? The questions tormented me, but finding answers seemed less important than finding a way to survive. By the end of that week, I had collected enough video evidence to prove what David was doing to me. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed allies, people who could help me escape this situation and bring David to justice. The isolation he had created by insisting on caring for me personally meant that most of our friends and family saw him as a devoted husband. Convincing anyone that he was capable of poisoning me would require more than just my word against his. The decision to reach out for help felt like stepping into another world entirely. For months, my universe had shrunk to the confines of our home and the medical offices where we sought treatment for my mysterious illness. David had been my primary connection to the outside world, filtering my interactions and managing my relationships. Breaking free from that isolation meant rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I chose to start with my college friend Lisa, someone who had known me long before I met David, and who had maintained a friendship despite the distance that had grown between us during my illness. Lisa worked as a paralegal at a law firm in Portland, about an hour away from our home in Riverside. Her legal background and her loyalty to our friendship made her the ideal person to confide in, but I still struggled with how to explain what I'd discovered without sounding completely insane. The phone call to Lisa required careful timing. I waited until David left for a full day of clinical rotations, giving me several hours to talk without interruption. My hands shook as I dialed her number, not from my illness this time, but from the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. When Lisa answered, her voice filled with genuine concern about my health, I almost lost my nerve. The story I needed to tell sounded impossible even to me. Lisa listened without interruption as I explained everything from the beginning, from my gradual decline in health, to the installation of the cameras, to the horrifying discovery of David's tampering with my medications. I could hear the shock in her silence when I finished speaking. For a long moment, neither of us said anything, and I worried that even my closest friend would think I'd lost my mind. But Lisa's response was exactly what I needed. Instead of questioning my sanity or suggesting alternative explanations, she immediately began asking practical questions about the evidence I'd collected and what kind of help I needed. Her legal training kicked in, and she started thinking about the best way to protect me while building a case against David. Her unwavering belief in my account of events felt like a lifeline after months of feeling completely alone. Lisa's first concern was my immediate safety. She pointed out that David might become dangerous if he suspected I knew about his activities. We discussed the possibility of me leaving the house immediately, but I was too weak from months of poisoning to manage on my own, and any sudden change in my routine might alert David to my discovery. Instead, we developed a plan that would allow me to gather more evidence while ensuring I had support and protection. The strategy we devised was complex but necessary. Lisa would drive down from Portland the next weekend, ostensibly for a casual visit to check on my health. During her stay, she would help me copy all the camera footage to multiple secure locations and document everything we'd discovered. She would also bring a friend who worked as a private investigator, someone who could advise us on the best way to present our evidence to law enforcement. In the days leading up to Lisa's visit, I had to master the art of deception in my own home. Every interaction with David became a carefully choreographed performance, where I played the role of the trusting, sick wife while gathering intelligence about his methods and motivations. The psychological strain was overwhelming, but it was the only way to protect myself until help arrived. I began paying closer attention to David's daily routines, looking for patterns that might reveal more about his poisoning schedule. He kept the mysterious white powder hidden behind the coffee maker, retrieving it only when he thought I was sleeping or too sick to notice. The vial was small, maybe the size of a prescription bottle, and he handled it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I started timing his medication preparation sessions, noting that he spent significantly longer in the kitchen when he planned to add the substance to my pills. The hardest part was continuing to take the contaminated medications while appearing grateful for his care. I developed subtle ways to minimize my exposure when possible, pretending to swallow pills that I actually palmed and disposed of later, or claiming nausea prevented me from taking certain vitamins. But I had to be careful not to improve too dramatically, as any significant change in my condition might make David suspicious about his dosing or my compliance. During this period, I also started paying attention to David's emotional state and behavior patterns. I noticed that he seemed more relaxed and affectionate on days when he increased the dosage, as if my increased suffering brought him some form of satisfaction. On days when I showed signs of improvement, he appeared agitated and would often suggest additional supplements or medications to help maintain my progress. The psychological profile that emerged was deeply disturbing. Lisa arrived on a Saturday morning, bringing with her an energy and clarity that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Seeing her healthy, vibrant presence in my home made me acutely aware of how much my world had shrunk during my illness. David welcomed her warmly, playing the role of the concerned husband perfectly, expressing gratitude that someone cared enough to visit during such a difficult time. His performance was so convincing that I momentarily doubted my own discoveries. But Lisa had come prepared. She brought her laptop, ostensibly to show me photos from a recent vacation, but actually to help me transfer and secure all the camera footage. While David was in the garage working on his motorcycle, we moved quickly to download everything onto multiple encrypted drives. Lisa's paralegal training was invaluable as she helped me organize the evidence chronologically and create detailed notes about each instance of tampering we'd recorded. The private investigator Lisa had mentioned turned out to be a woman named Detective Sarah Rodriguez, a former police officer who now worked freelance cases. She arrived at our house Sunday afternoon, introduced as Lisa's friend who wanted to meet me after hearing about my health struggles. David again played his part perfectly, describing my symptoms and the frustrating lack of medical answers with such apparent concern that I could see Detective Rodriguez initially viewing him as a devoted spouse. But Rodriguez was trained to observe details others might miss. While David spoke about my illness, she watched his body language and facial expressions with professional scrutiny. When he described my worst episodes, she noticed the subtle satisfaction that flickered across his features. When he talked about his own sacrifices and dedication to my care, she caught the self-congratulatory tone that crept into his voice. By the end of her visit, I could tell she believed our suspicions were warranted. The three of us met privately Monday morning after David left for clinical rotations. Rodriguez had reviewed some of the camera footage on Lisa's laptop, and her expression was grim when she confirmed that what we'd captured was clear evidence of deliberate poisoning. She explained that the video quality was excellent and that David's actions were unambiguous enough to support criminal charges. But she also warned us about the challenges we'd face in bringing him to justice. Rodriguez outlined the steps we'd need to take to build a prosecutable case. First, we needed to identify the substance David was using to poison me, which would require either getting a sample for testing or having blood work done that specifically looked for uncommon toxins. Second, we needed to establish his access to the poison and his knowledge of its effects. Third, we needed to document his motive, whether financial gain, desire to be with someone else, or psychological gratification from controlling and harming me. The conversation about motive led to some uncomfortable realizations about my marriage that I'd been avoiding. Rodriguez asked pointed questions about our financial situation, David's relationships with other people, and any signs of psychological instability I might have overlooked. As I answered her questions, patterns emerged that painted a disturbing picture of the man I'd thought I knew. Our life insurance policies had been increased significantly just 6 months before my illness began, with David suggesting we needed better coverage as we approached middle age. He'd been the one to research and purchase the policies, and I'd signed the paperwork without much thought. The timing now seemed ominous rather than prudent. Rodriguez made notes about the insurance, while explaining that life insurance fraud was a common motive in spousal poisoning cases. I also began to reconsider David's relationships with his classmates and colleagues at the nursing program. He'd mentioned several times how impressed his instructors were with his dedication to caring for a sick spouse, and how his clinical supervisors often praised his compassion and attention to detail. I realized he might be using my illness to enhance his reputation and advance his career, presenting himself as a long-suffering husband whose devotion to his wife demonstrated his fitness for the nursing profession. More troubling were the subtle signs of psychological manipulation I'd been interpreting as love and concern. David had gradually isolated me from friends and family by suggesting that visitors tired me too much, or that my condition was too embarrassing to share with others. He'd taken over most of our social interactions, explaining my absence from gatherings as necessary for my health, while positioning himself as the heroic caregiver managing an impossible situation. Rodriguez also helped me understand the sophisticated nature of David's poisoning method. By varying the dosage and timing of the substance, he'd created a pattern of symptoms that appeared random and medically mysterious. The periods of improvement followed by sudden relapses had convinced doctors that I was dealing with some rare condition rather than deliberate harm. His nursing education had taught him exactly how to create a convincing medical mystery while avoiding detection. The detective's next recommendation was that I needed to get medical testing done without David's knowledge, specifically looking for substances that might not appear in standard blood work. She had contacts at a private lab that could run comprehensive toxicology screens, but getting samples would require careful planning, since David monitored my medical care so closely. Lisa volunteered to help coordinate the secret medical testing. She would drive me to the lab while David was at school, using the cover story that we were going shopping or having lunch together. The testing would need to include blood, urine, and hair samples to detect both recent exposure and long-term accumulation of toxins. Rodriguez warned that depending on what substance David was using, we might not find definitive proof, but any unusual findings would strengthen our case. We also discussed the challenges of gathering evidence about David's access to poisonous substances. His nursing program gave him opportunities to learn about various medications and their toxic effects, but actually obtaining controlled substances would require more investigation. Rodriguez suggested that I try to find out more about his clinical rotation sites and the specific departments where he'd been working, as some areas of hospitals would have easier access to dangerous materials than others. The conversation about next steps was interrupted by the sound of David's car in the driveway, much earlier than his usual return time. Lisa quickly closed her laptop while Rodriguez moved to the living room, adopting the casual posture of someone just chatting with friends. I positioned myself on the couch with a blanket, trying to look appropriately ill while my heart raced from the close call. David entered with his usual expression of concern, explaining that his morning clinical rotation had been canceled due to a staff meeting. He seemed pleased to see that Lisa was still visiting, commenting on how good it was for me to have company during my recovery. His ability to slip seamlessly into the caring husband role while I sat there knowing he'd been poisoning me was almost impressive in its audacity. Rodriguez handled the situation perfectly, making small talk about her own experiences with family health issues while studying David's responses and behavior. She mentioned that she'd heard about cases where mysterious illnesses turned out to have environmental causes, watching carefully for his reaction to the suggestion that external factors might be involved in my condition. David's response was smooth and seemingly helpful, but I caught the slight tension in his posture when the conversation moved toward potential outside causes for my symptoms. After Rodriguez left, David seemed more attentive than usual, asking detailed questions about what we'd discussed and whether Lisa's friend had any helpful suggestions about my condition. His interest felt predatory rather than caring, as if he was trying to determine whether our conversation posed any threat to his activities. I kept my responses vague, and focused on Rodriguez's general comments about staying positive and working with doctors to find answers. That evening, I watched David prepare my medications with new understanding of the psychological game he was playing. He made a show of reading each bottle label carefully, explaining what each pill was supposed to do for my condition, and expressing hope that the combination would finally provide some relief. All the while, I knew he was planning to add the substance that would ensure my continued suffering. The performance was so elaborate that I wondered if he'd convinced himself that he was actually helping me in some twisted way. The next few days passed in a surreal haze of pretending normalcy while planning my escape from a nightmare I'd been living for months. Lisa called daily to check on me, using coded language to discuss our plans without alerting David if he happened to overhear. Rodriguez had begun her investigation into David's background and access to potentially harmful substances, promising to update us as soon as she had useful information. I continued documenting David's poisoning routine with the hidden cameras, building an extensive library of evidence that showed his consistent tampering with my medications. The footage was damning, clearly showing his deliberate addition of the unknown substance and his careful efforts to hide his activities. But Rodriguez had warned that video evidence alone might not be enough if David's lawyer could suggest alternative explanations for his behavior. The breakthrough in identifying the poison came sooner than expected. Rodriguez called on Thursday morning with news that she'd discovered David had been working clinical rotations in the hospital's oncology unit, where he would have had access to chemotherapy drugs and other powerful medications. Some cancer treatments, when administered in small doses to healthy individuals, could cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. The connection was circumstantial but provided a logical explanation for both David's access to the poison and his knowledge of its effects. This information changed our strategy significantly. If David was using chemotherapy drugs to poison me, the toxicology testing would need to be specifically designed to detect those substances. Rodriguez had contacts who could arrange for the appropriate tests, but we needed to act quickly since some of these drugs cleared the system relatively fast. We scheduled the secret lab appointment for the following Monday, giving us the weekend to prepare our cover story and ensure David wouldn't suspect anything. The plan required Lisa to drive down from Portland early Monday morning, arriving while David was at his clinical rotation. I would tell him that Lisa was taking me out for a brief change of scenery, something doctors had actually recommended to help with my depression and isolation. The story was believable enough that David shouldn't be suspicious, especially since he'd been encouraging me to get out of the house more often. But as the weekend approached, I noticed changes in David's behavior that made me nervous about our timing. He seemed more observant than usual, paying closer attention to my phone calls and asking more detailed questions about my daily activities. When Lisa called to confirm our Monday plans, David lingered nearby during the conversation, something he'd never done before. I began to worry that he suspected something had changed, though I couldn't pinpoint what might have triggered his increased vigilance. Saturday evening brought a new level of psychological torture, as David prepared what he announced would be a special dinner to celebrate one of my better days. He spent over an hour in the kitchen, preparing my favorite meal with elaborate care while I sat in the living room, trying to appear grateful and excited. The smell of the food made me nauseated, not because of my illness this time, but because I knew he was probably contaminating it with poison while humming contentedly to himself. When David served the meal, his attention to my reactions was more intense than usual. He watched every bite I took, commenting on how good it was to see me eating with appetite and expressing hope that this might be a turning point in my recovery. The predatory focus of his observation made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to eat enough to maintain the pretense that I trusted him completely. That night, the symptoms hit harder than they had in weeks. The nausea was so severe that I couldn't keep any fluids down, and the confusion was so intense that I lost several hours of memory. David was attentive and concerned, holding my hair back while I vomited and bringing cool washcloths for my forehead. His tenderness during my suffering felt like the cruelest aspect of his deception, and I struggled not to scream at him to stop pretending to care about me. Sunday brought a slight improvement in my condition, but I was weak and shaky from the previous night's ordeal. David suggested postponing any plans I might have for Monday, recommending that I focus on resting and recovering from what he described as a significant setback. His concern seemed genuine enough that I almost wondered if I'd imagined everything, if my sick mind had created an elaborate conspiracy where none existed. But the camera footage from Saturday evening confirmed my worst fears. David had indeed tampered with my dinner, adding what appeared to be a larger dose of the white powder than I'd seen him use before. He'd also added something to my evening drink, working with the methodical precision of someone following a carefully planned protocol. The increase in dosage explained the severity of my reaction and confirmed that he was escalating his poisoning efforts. The realization that David was increasing the intensity of his attacks created a new sense of urgency about our investigation. If he continued escalating the dosages, my body might not be able to survive much longer. The months of gradual poisoning had weakened my system considerably, and a few more nights like Saturday could cause permanent damage or death. I needed to act quickly, regardless of the risks involved in exposing our plans. Lisa arrived Monday morning as scheduled, but I was almost too weak to make the trip to the lab. The previous weekend's poisoning had left me dizzy and nauseated, with a tremor in my hands that made it difficult to sign the consent forms for testing. But Rodriguez had emphasized the importance of getting samples while any evidence might still be detectable in my system, so I forced myself to go through with the plan. The lab technician who drew my blood was professional and discreet, asking no questions about the unusual toxicology panel Rodriguez had requested. The tests would look specifically for chemotherapy drugs and other hospital medications that could cause my symptoms when administered inappropriately. Results would be available within 48 hours, giving us the evidence we needed to approach law enforcement if the tests confirmed our suspicions. But as Lisa drove me home from the lab, I noticed David's car in our driveway much earlier than expected. My heart sank as I realized he'd returned from his clinical rotation while we were gone, despite his schedule indicating he should be at the hospital until late afternoon. I had no explanation for our absence that wouldn't raise suspicions, especially given my obviously weakened condition from the weekend's poisoning. David met us at the door with an expression of concern mixed with something that looked like suspicion. He'd been worried when he came home and found me gone, he explained, especially since I'd been so sick over the weekend. Where had we gone? Why hadn't I left a note explaining our plans? His questions felt like an interrogation disguised as loving concern, and I could tell that Lisa sensed the underlying threat in his demeanor. I explained that we'd just driven around town for a change of scenery, something my doctors had recommended to help with my depression. Lisa supported the story, describing how we'd stopped at a few shops and gotten lunch at a quiet restaurant. David seemed to accept the explanation, but his attention to my physical condition was more intense than usual. He commented on how pale and weak I looked, suggesting that even short outings might be too strenuous for my current state of health. That evening, David announced that he thought it would be best if I avoided any more trips away from home until my condition stabilized. He'd spoken with one of his nursing instructors about my case, he claimed, and they'd advised that patients with my type of symptoms needed complete rest and minimal stimulation. The suggestion felt like a prison sentence disguised as medical advice, and I realized that our investigation had triggered increased control over my movements. The toxicology results arrived Wednesday morning while David was at school, delivered by secure courier as Rodriguez had arranged. Lisa drove over immediately to review them with me, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. The tests showed significant levels of multiple chemotherapy drugs in my system, substances that had no legitimate reason to be present in my body. The concentrations were consistent with regular small doses administered over an extended period, exactly matching the pattern of David's tampering with my medications. Rodriguez arrived that afternoon to review the lab results and plan our next steps. The evidence was now overwhelming and actionable. We had video documentation of David poisoning my medications, medical evidence of toxic substances in my system, and proof of his access to those substances through his hospital rotations. The case was strong enough to warrant immediate police intervention, but Rodriguez wanted to coordinate the arrest carefully to ensure my safety and the preservation of evidence. The plan we developed was complex, but necessary to protect me from potential retaliation. Rodriguez would contact the local police department and arrange for David to be arrested at the hospital during his Thursday clinical rotation, preventing him from returning home and potentially destroying evidence or harming me. Simultaneously, crime scene technicians would search our house for the poison and any other evidence of his activities. I would stay with Lisa in Portland until David was safely in custody, removing me from any danger while the arrest took place. Lisa had already cleared her schedule to provide support during what we all knew would be a traumatic transition from victim to survivor. The thought of finally being free from David's control was both exhilarating and terrifying, as it meant acknowledging that the man I'd loved and trusted had been systematically trying to kill me. But as Thursday morning approached, I began to notice changes in David's behavior that suggested he might suspect something was wrong. He was asking more questions about my phone calls and showing increased interest in my daily activities. Wednesday evening, he'd spent an unusually long time preparing my medications, and I'd caught him looking through my personal belongings while I was supposedly napping. The final night I spent in that house was surreal beyond description. David went through his usual routine of caring for the sick wife, bringing me contaminated medications and expressing hope for my recovery while knowing he was slowly killing me. I pretended to take the pills while actually palming them, no longer willing to subject my body to any more of his poison now that help was finally coming. As I lay in bed listening to David's breathing beside me, I reflected on the months of deception and manipulation I'd endured. The psychological damage felt almost as severe as the physical harm he'd caused. He'd made me doubt my own perceptions, question my sanity, and depend completely on him for my survival while he systematically destroyed my health. The violation of trust was so profound that I wondered if I'd ever be able to have normal relationships again. But I'd also discovered reserves of strength and intelligence I hadn't known I possessed. Despite being poisoned and psychologically manipulated, I'd managed to uncover David's crimes and gather the evidence needed to stop him. The cameras had been the key to my survival, providing objective documentation of crimes that would otherwise have been impossible to prove. Without that technology, I might have continued deteriorating until David's poison finally killed me. Thursday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. David prepared for his clinical rotation as usual, kissing me goodbye and reminding me to rest while he was gone. His concern seemed so genuine that for a moment I almost doubted everything we'd discovered. But the toxicology results were undeniable proof of his crimes, and the video evidence showed clearly that his loving care was actually attempted murder disguised as devotion. Lisa arrived 30 minutes after David left, helping me pack a small bag for my stay in Portland. I moved slowly through the house, gathering essentials while trying to process that this might be the last time I'd see the home where I'd been systematically poisoned for months. Everything looked the same, but my understanding of what had happened in these rooms had changed completely. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the kitchen where David had prepared countless contaminated meals and medications. The coffee maker that had hidden his poison looked innocuous, just another appliance in what had appeared to be a normal home. The ordinariness of the setting made his crimes even more chilling, proof that evil could hide behind the most mundane facades. Rodriguez called as we were driving toward Portland to confirm that everything was proceeding according to plan. The police had coordinated with hospital security to arrest David during his clinical rotation, minimizing the chance of a confrontation or escape attempt. Crime scene technicians were standing by to search our house as soon as the arrest was made, looking for the poison and any other evidence of his activities. The drive to Portland felt like emerging from a nightmare into waking reality. For the first time in months, I was completely safe from David's poison, surrounded by people who believed me and were working to protect me. The physical symptoms that had plagued me for so long began to feel less overwhelming now that I knew their cause and could begin the process of recovery. But the emotional trauma was just beginning to surface. As the immediate danger receded, I started processing the full scope of what David had done to me. He'd not only tried to kill me, but had done it while pretending to love me, while accepting sympathy and praise for his devoted care of a sick wife. The psychological manipulation had been as harmful as the physical poisoning, leaving me with wounds that would take much longer to heal than my body's recovery from the toxic substances. The phone call came at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. Rodriguez's voice was steady but carried an undertone of satisfaction as she delivered the news I'd been waiting for. David had been arrested without incident during his clinical rotation at Riverside General Hospital. The crime scene team was already processing our house, and they'd found the vial of powdered chemotherapy drugs hidden exactly where the camera footage had shown David keeping it behind the coffee maker. Sitting in Lisa's Portland apartment, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief wash over me. For months, I'd been living in a nightmare that masqueraded as reality, where the person I trusted most was slowly killing me while everyone around us praised his devotion. Now, suddenly, the nightmare had a name and the monster had been captured. Yet part of me still struggled to accept that it was really over. The evidence they'd recovered from our house was more extensive than any of us had anticipated. In addition to the chemotherapy drugs David had been adding to my medications, investigators found detailed notes about dosages and my reactions hidden in his nursing textbooks. He'd been keeping a clinical record of his poisoning regimen, documenting my symptoms like a scientist studying lab results. The methodical nature of his record-keeping revealed a level of premeditation that chilled me to the bone. Rodriguez explained that David's notes indicated he'd been planning this for nearly a year before my symptoms began. The timing coincided with our increased life insurance policies, which now took on an even more sinister significance. He'd researched various substances and their effects before settling on the chemotherapy drugs, choosing them specifically because they would create symptoms that appeared to be a mysterious illness rather than obvious poisoning. The psychological profile that emerged from his notes was deeply disturbing. David had written detailed observations about my emotional state during different phases of my illness, noting when I seemed most dependent on him and when I showed signs of suspicion or independence. He'd been manipulating not just my physical health, but my entire psychological reality, calibrating his poison to maximize my dependence, while maintaining his image as the perfect caregiver. What struck me most about his documentation was the complete absence of any emotional connection to my suffering. His notes read like a detached medical study, with clinical descriptions of my pain and deterioration that showed no trace of love, guilt, or remorse. The man who had held me while I vomited, who had stroked my hair during my worst episodes, had been coldly recording my agony like data points in an experiment. The legal proceedings began immediately. District Attorney Michael Chen contacted me through Rodriguez to discuss the charges they planned to file against David. The evidence was strong enough to support attempted murder charges, as well as assault, domestic violence, and insurance fraud. The video footage, combined with the toxicology results and David's own notes, created an overwhelming case that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. But Chen warned me that the trial process would be long and emotionally difficult. David's defense team would likely argue that his actions were motivated by mental illness rather than criminal intent, attempting to generate sympathy for someone they'd portray as a dedicated husband who'd suffered a psychological breakdown. They might also try to suggest that I'd somehow contributed to or even orchestrated my own poisoning, a victim-blaming strategy that was unfortunately common in domestic violence cases. The prospect of facing David in court terrified me more than I'd expected. During our marriage, he'd been skilled at making me doubt my own perceptions and question my judgment. Even now, knowing the truth and having overwhelming evidence of his crimes, I worried that his manipulation skills might be effective with a jury. His ability to present himself as caring and devoted had fooled medical professionals for months. What would prevent him from fooling 12 strangers who knew nothing about our real relationship? Lisa became my anchor during this turbulent period, providing both practical support and emotional stability as I navigated the complex process of transitioning from victim to survivor. Her legal background helped her translate the attorney's explanations into terms I could understand, while her friendship gave me a safe space to process the overwhelming emotions that surfaced as the shock began to wear off. The physical recovery from months of poisoning was surprisingly rapid once the toxic substances stopped entering my system. Within a week of leaving home, my energy levels began to improve noticeably. The nausea that had plagued me for months gradually subsided, and the mental confusion that had made simple tasks impossible started to clear. It was as if a fog I'd grown accustomed to living in was finally lifting, revealing how significantly David's poison had impaired my cognitive abilities. But the psychological healing proved much more complex. Sleep became elusive as my mind processed the full scope of what had happened to me. I'd lie awake replaying interactions with David, seeing them now through the lens of truth, rather than the filter of trust I'd applied at the time. Conversations that had seemed loving and supportive revealed themselves as calculated manipulation when viewed with clear understanding of his motives. The betrayal went deeper than just the poisoning itself. David had stolen months of my life, destroyed my health, and perverted every expression of love and care into instruments of harm. He'd made me doubt my own sanity while systematically destroying my body. The violation felt so profound that I sometimes wondered if I'd ever be able to trust my own judgment again, let alone trust another person. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a therapist who specialized in trauma from domestic violence, helped me understand that my reactions were normal responses to extraordinary abuse. She explained that David's methods constituted a particularly insidious form of domestic violence that combined physical harm with psychological manipulation in ways that were designed to make the victim question reality itself. The technical term was medical abuse, and it was more common than most people realized. Through therapy, I began to understand how David had gradually isolated me and made me dependent on him long before the poisoning began. He discouraged my friendships, taken over our social interactions, and positioned himself as the sole interpreter of my medical needs. By the time he started adding poison to my medications, I was already so reliant on him for basic care that questioning his actions felt impossible. The realization that David's abuse had been escalating for years before the poisoning made me reconsider our entire relationship. Behaviors I'd interpreted as protectiveness now seemed controlling. His attention to my health and well-being revealed itself as surveillance and manipulation. Even our early courtship took on a different character when I realized how skillfully he'd identified and exploited my vulnerabilities from the very beginning. 3 weeks after David's arrest, Rodriguez contacted me with news that would change everything again. During their investigation of David's background, they discovered evidence suggesting I wasn't his first victim. Hospital records from his previous clinical rotations showed patterns of unexplained patient complications during his shifts. Complications that now seemed suspicious given what we knew about his access to medications and his willingness to use them as weapons. The investigators were reopening cases involving unexplained deaths and illnesses at facilities where David had worked or trained. They'd found 3 cases of particular interest: an elderly patient who died of apparent medication complications during David's rotation in the cardiac unit, a middle-aged woman who'd experienced mysterious symptoms during her hospital stay while David was assigned to her floor, and another nursing student who'd become inexplicably ill during a clinical program David had attended. This information reframed David's crimes against me as part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior rather than an isolated incident of domestic violence. It suggested that his interest in nursing might have been motivated less by a desire to help people than by a desire for access to vulnerable victims and dangerous substances. The scope of potential harm he might have caused was staggering to contemplate. The possibility that David had killed or harmed other people added a new dimension to my trauma. I'd thought his betrayal of our marriage was the ultimate violation, but learning that he might be a serial killer who'd used his medical training to harm multiple victims made me feel complicit in ways I couldn't fully understand. If I'd recognized his true nature earlier, could I have prevented him from hurting others? Dr. Hawkins helped me work through the misplaced guilt I felt about David's other potential victims. She emphasized that I'd been a victim myself, systematically poisoned and psychologically manipulated to the point where recognizing the abuse was nearly impossible. The responsibility for David's crimes lay entirely with him, not with the people he'd deceived and harmed. My survival and the evidence I'd gathered had likely prevented him from claiming additional victims. The media attention surrounding David's arrest was more intense than I'd anticipated. The story of a nursing student who'd poisoned his own wife while presenting himself as a devoted caregiver captured public interest in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. Reporters called constantly, seeking interviews and personal details about our marriage and my illness. The violation of privacy felt like another form of abuse, though this time from strangers, rather than someone I'd trusted. Lisa helped me develop strategies for managing the media attention without compromising the legal case against David. We issued a brief statement through the district attorney's office confirming the basic facts while requesting privacy during the legal proceedings. But the coverage continued, with speculation about David's motives and detailed analysis of his methods that made me feel exposed and vulnerable all over again. Reading about my own case in news articles was surreal and disturbing. Journalists described our marriage and my illness with clinical detachment that reduced my trauma to sensational headlines and soundbites. They focused on the shocking nature of David's deception, while largely ignoring the human cost of his crimes. I became a character in a story rather than a person who'd survived attempted murder by someone I'd loved. The preliminary hearings began in November, 2 months after David's arrest. Seeing him in court for the first time since learning the truth about his crimes was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. He appeared smaller and more ordinary than the monster I'd built up in my mind, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of scrubs, but still carrying himself with the confident demeanor I'd once found attractive. David's defense attorney, Rebecca Martinez, immediately began implementing the strategy Chen had warned me about. She portrayed David as a loving husband who'd suffered a psychological breakdown under the stress of caring for a chronically ill wife. She suggested that his actions were the result of untreated mental illness rather than criminal intent, painting him as another victim of circumstances beyond his control. Martinez also began laying groundwork for what would become their primary defense strategy, claiming that David's poisoning of my medications was actually a misguided attempt to help me. She suggested that he'd been trying to administer treatments he'd learned about in nursing school, motivated by desperation to cure an illness that baffled medical professionals. It was a ridiculous argument given the evidence, but she presented it with enough conviction to plant seeds of doubt. The most disturbing aspect of Martinez's defense was her suggestion that I might have been complicit in my own poisoning, either consciously or unconsciously. She hinted that my desperate desire for answers about my illness might have led me to exaggerate or misinterpret David's actions. This victim-blaming approach was exactly what Chen had prepared me for, but experiencing it firsthand was still shocking and painful. Watching David sit silently while his attorney portrayed him as a devoted husband and questioned my credibility was almost unbearable. The man who'd systematically poisoned me for months was being presented as the real victim, while I was cast as either unstable or dishonest. The courthouse that was supposed to provide justice felt like another place where I was being victimized and manipulated. But the evidence spoke louder than Martinez's narratives. When Chen presented the video footage of David adding unknown substances to my medications, the courtroom fell silent. The clear documentation of his deliberate actions was impossible to explain away as misguided medical care or psychological breakdown. His own notes about dosages and my reactions further undermined any claim that his behavior was motivated by love or concern. The toxicology evidence was equally damning. Expert witnesses explained that the chemotherapy drugs found in my system could only have come from external administration, and that the pattern of exposure was consistent with regular small doses over an extended period. There was no legitimate medical reason for those substances to be in my body, and David's access to them through his hospital rotations provided a clear explanation for how he'd obtained them. Rodriguez's testimony about the investigation was particularly powerful. She walked the jury through the process of discovering David's crimes, from my initial suspicions through the camera footage to the final arrest. Her professional expertise and calm presentation of facts created a compelling narrative that was difficult for the defense to challenge. She'd seen cases like this before, she explained, and David's methods were consistent with calculated domestic violence rather than mental illness. The most emotionally difficult part of the proceedings was my own testimony. Taking the stand to describe months of illness and David's apparent care, while knowing the truth about his actions, required me to relive the entire nightmare in public. Martinez's cross-examination was aggressive and intimidating, as she tried to shake my memory of events and suggest alternative explanations for what I'd experienced. But the preparation with Chen's team had equipped me to handle her attacks on my credibility. I remained calm and factual, sticking to the documented evidence rather than engaging with her hypothetical scenarios. When she suggested that my illness might have caused me to misinterpret David's actions, I simply pointed to the video footage and medical evidence that spoke for themselves. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from medical experts, law enforcement officers, and character witnesses for both sides. David's family and friends testified about his previously good character and his apparent devotion to me during my illness. Their genuine belief in his innocence was almost more painful than his crimes themselves, as it showed how effectively he'd deceived everyone around us. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. David was convicted of attempted murder, assault, domestic violence, and insurance fraud, with sentencing scheduled for the following month. The relief I felt at hearing those verdicts was tempered by the knowledge that the legal process was just one step in a much longer journey toward healing and recovery. The sentencing hearing brought some closure but also opened new wounds. David finally spoke publicly about his crimes, but his statement was more about self-pity than genuine remorse. He claimed that the stress of my illness had driven him to actions he couldn't fully explain or understand. He never acknowledged the deliberate nature of his poisoning, or took responsibility for the months of suffering he'd caused. Judge Patricia Holbrook sentenced David to 25 years in prison, noting the calculating nature of his crimes and the vulnerability of his victim. She emphasized that his abuse of medical knowledge and his position of trust made his actions particularly heinous. The sentence felt appropriate given the severity of his crimes, but it couldn't restore the months of my life he'd stolen or undo the psychological damage he'd caused. As I left the courthouse after sentencing, I realized that the legal proceedings had provided justice but not healing. David would be punished for his crimes, but I still had to rebuild my life and learn to trust again. The real work of recovery was just beginning, and it would require strength and determination that the legal system couldn't provide. But for the first time in over a year, I felt truly free to begin that journey on my own terms. The weeks following David's sentencing brought an unexpected emptiness that I hadn't anticipated. For months, my entire existence had revolved around surviving his poisoning, gathering evidence, and seeking justice through the legal system. Now that he was safely locked away and the immediate crisis had passed, I found myself adrift in a world that suddenly felt foreign and overwhelming. Returning to my house in Riverside was impossible, at least initially. The crime scene tape had been removed and the investigators had finished their work, but every room held memories of David's deception and my suffering. The kitchen where he'd prepared contaminated meals, the bedroom where he'd administered poisoned medications while whispering words of love, the living room where I'd spent countless hours too sick to function while he played the role of devoted caregiver. The physical space itself had become contaminated with trauma that cleaning couldn't eliminate. Lisa suggested I stay with her in Portland permanently, but I knew that running away from Riverside wouldn't solve the deeper issues I was facing. The house represented more than just a crime scene. It was the home where I'd built a life before David's betrayal, where I'd established my design business and cultivated friendships in the community. Abandoning it entirely would mean letting his crimes take even more from me than they already had. Dr. Hawkins helped me understand that reclaiming my physical space would be an important part of the healing process, but it needed to happen gradually and with proper support. She recommended starting with short visits during daylight hours, accompanied by trusted friends, to begin the process of creating new associations with the environment. The goal wasn't to erase what had happened, but to prove to myself that I could exist in that space without being controlled by the trauma. The first time I walked into my house after David's sentencing, I lasted less than 10 minutes before the panic attack hit. The familiar smell of our home, unchanged despite everything that had occurred there, triggered a flood of memories and emotions that overwhelmed my carefully constructed sense of safety. Lisa found me hyperventilating on the front steps, completely unable to explain what had caused such an intense reaction to my own front door. But I kept trying, each visit lasting a little longer than the previous one. I started by simply sitting in the driveway, looking at the house from the safety of Lisa's car. Then I progressed to standing on the porch, then entering just the living room, gradually expanding my comfort zone as my nervous system learned that the space no longer contained any actual danger. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, but each small victory felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that David had stolen. The investigation into David's other potential victims began yielding results that complicated my own healing process. Detective Rodriguez contacted me regularly with updates about cases they were reviewing, seeking my input about David's behavioral patterns and methods. While I wanted to help bring justice for other people he might have harmed, each new revelation about his capacity for violence reopened wounds I was trying to heal. The case that haunted me most involved Margaret Thornton, a 73-year-old woman who had died during David's rotation in the cardiac intensive care unit 8 months before my poisoning began. She'd been recovering well from routine surgery when she suddenly developed complications that led to cardiac arrest and death. The hospital had attributed her death to an unexpected drug interaction, but investigators now suspected that David had administered unauthorized medications that caused her fatal complications. Margaret's daughter Carol reached out to me through Rodriguez after learning about the investigation into her mother's death. She wanted to understand what kind of person David was, hoping that insight into his psychology might help her make sense of her mother's sudden decline and death. Meeting with Carol was one of the most difficult conversations of my life, as I tried to explain the calculating cruelty I'd experienced while being sensitive to her grief and confusion. Carol described her mother as a vibrant woman who had been looking forward to recovery and return to her independent lifestyle. Margaret had specifically mentioned how kind and attentive one of her nurses had been, a young man who took extra time to explain her medications and check on her comfort. The description matched David's behavior during my illness perfectly, the same caring facade that masked his true intentions. What made Margaret's case particularly tragic was that her death had been so sudden and seemingly natural that no one had questioned it at the time. David's medical knowledge had allowed him to kill her in a way that appeared to be an unfortunate but explainable medical event. If I hadn't survived his poisoning attempts and gathered evidence of his crimes, Margaret's murder would never have been discovered, and her family would never have known that their grief was the result of deliberate violence rather than medical misfortune. The realization that my survival had led to justice for other victims gave me a sense of purpose that helped counteract the isolation and depression I was struggling with. Carol and I began corresponding regularly, sharing our experiences with David's deception and supporting each other through the complicated process of understanding how we'd been manipulated by someone we'd trusted. Her perspective helped me see my own experience as part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated personal failure. As more cases emerged, a disturbing picture developed of David's progression from opportunistic harm to calculated murder. The timeline suggested that he'd been experimenting with ways to hurt vulnerable people for years before settling on the systematic poisoning approach he'd used against me. His crimes showed escalating sophistication and confidence, as if each successful deception had emboldened him to attempt more ambitious schemes. The nursing school where David had been studying faced intense scrutiny, as investigators tried to understand how his behavior had gone undetected for so long. Several of his instructors and classmates were interviewed about his demeanor and performance, but most described him as an exemplary student who showed genuine compassion for patients and dedication to the profession. His ability to maintain this facade while committing serious crimes demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that was deeply unsettling. One instructor, Professor Janet Mills, admitted that she'd occasionally noticed David showing unusual interest in pharmacology and drug interactions, but she'd attributed this to academic curiosity rather than suspicious intent. He'd asked detailed questions about medication effects and had written several papers about adverse drug reactions that had impressed his professors with their thoroughness and insight. What had seemed like scholarly excellence was actually research for his criminal activities. The discovery that David had used his education as a tool for harm rather than healing felt like a betrayal of the entire medical profession. Nurses were supposed to be advocates for patient safety and well-being, but he'd perverted that role into something predatory and dangerous. The violation went beyond just personal betrayal. It undermined trust in healthcare institutions and the people who were supposed to provide care and protection. My own relationship with the medical system became complicated as I tried to resume normal healthcare after months of being systematically poisoned by someone with medical training. Routine appointments triggered anxiety and hypervigilance as I found myself scrutinizing every medication and procedure with suspicion. Dr. Harrison, my family physician who had struggled to diagnose my mysterious illness, was patient and understanding as we worked together to rebuild my trust in medical care. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's crimes had been discovered largely because he'd been too successful at creating medical mysteries that prompted extensive testing and specialist consultations. If he'd been content with making me mildly ill rather than pushing toward what appeared to be a fatal outcome, his poisoning might never have been detected. His greed and impatience had ultimately led to his downfall, but only after months of suffering that could have been avoided if I'd been more suspicious of his constant care. Physical recovery from the poisoning was slower than I'd initially hoped. While the acute symptoms had resolved quickly once the toxic substances stopped entering my system, the long-term effects of months of chemotherapy drug exposure were more persistent. I experienced fatigue and cognitive difficulties that lingered for months, requiring patience and realistic expectations about my healing timeline. Dr. Hawkins helped me understand that trauma recovery, both physical and psychological, was rarely linear, and that setbacks were normal parts of the process. The financial implications of David's crimes added another layer of stress to my recovery. Medical bills from the months of testing and specialist consultations had accumulated significantly, and my work had suffered during the period when I was too sick to meet client deadlines. The insurance companies were investigating the policies David had increased before beginning his poisoning campaign, but recovering those funds would take time and legal maneuvering that I was too exhausted to manage effectively. Lisa suggested consulting with an attorney about pursuing civil damages against David, but the prospect of more legal proceedings felt overwhelming when I was still struggling with basic daily functioning. The criminal case had provided justice and closure, but the idea of reliving the trauma through another court process seemed like it might cause more harm than any financial recovery would be worth. Gradually, I began to understand that healing wasn't about returning to the person I'd been before David's crimes, but about becoming someone new who could integrate the experience without being defined by it. Dr. Hawkins introduced me to other survivors of serious domestic violence, women who had experienced different forms of abuse but shared similar struggles with trust, safety, and rebuilding their lives after betrayal. These connections helped me realize that my experience, while unique in its specific details, was part of a broader pattern of intimate partner violence that affected countless women. The isolation I'd felt during my poisoning and recovery began to lift as I connected with people who understood the complex emotions involved in being betrayed by someone you'd loved and trusted. One woman, Sarah, had survived an attempt on her life by her ex-husband who had tried to make her death look like a suicide. Another, Michelle, had been financially devastated by a partner who had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit while presenting himself as a loving boyfriend. Their stories helped me understand that David's methods were unusual, but his willingness to harm someone he claimed to love was tragically common. Through these connections, I began to consider ways to use my experience to help other people who might be facing similar situations. The hidden cameras that had saved my life were becoming increasingly accessible and affordable, but many people didn't know they existed or how to use them effectively. There seemed to be an opportunity to educate potential victims about resources and strategies that could help them document abuse and seek help safely. The idea of becoming an advocate for other domestic violence survivors felt both terrifying and empowering. It would mean publicly discussing my experience and potentially facing skepticism or judgment from people who couldn't understand how someone could be systematically poisoned without realizing it. But it also offered a way to transform my trauma into something meaningful that could prevent other people from suffering similar harm. Dr. Hawkins supported my interest in advocacy work but cautioned that I needed to be further along in my own healing before taking on the emotional burden of helping other trauma survivors. She recommended starting small, perhaps writing about my experience or speaking to small groups, to test my emotional readiness for more extensive advocacy efforts. The decision to write about my experience publicly was not made lightly. Sharing the intimate details of how I'd been deceived and harmed felt like another form of vulnerability that could be exploited or misunderstood. But the potential to reach someone who might be in a similar situation and help them recognize warning signs or seek help seemed worth the risk of public exposure. My first blog post about the experience received an overwhelming response from readers who shared their own stories of medical abuse, domestic violence, and survival. Many people expressed gratitude for my willingness to discuss such a difficult topic openly, while others shared their own experiences with partners who had used their medical knowledge or access to harm rather than help. The response confirmed that David's crimes, while extreme, were part of a larger pattern of abuse that was often overlooked or misunderstood by law enforcement and healthcare providers. Medical abuse was a real phenomenon that affected more people than most professionals realized, and there was a significant need for education and awareness about this form of domestic violence. As I continued writing and connecting with other survivors, I began to see a path forward that felt meaningful and empowering. My experience had been traumatic and devastating, but it had also given me unique insights and knowledge that could benefit other people facing similar situations. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate was long and difficult, but it offered hope that something positive could emerge from even the darkest experiences. 2 years have passed since David's sentencing, and my life today bears little resemblance to the nightmare I once lived. The woman who installed those hidden cameras in desperation has evolved into someone I never expected to become. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate has been the most challenging and rewarding transformation of my life. The Riverside house that once felt like a crime scene has been completely renovated and transformed into something new. I kept the structure but changed everything else, from the kitchen where David prepared poisoned meals to the bedroom where he administered contaminated medications. Every room now holds memories of healing and growth rather than deception and suffering. The space that nearly became my tomb has become the headquarters for my new mission. The Ann Caldwell Foundation for Medical Abuse Awareness officially launched 18 months ago, named to honor my maiden name and the woman I was before David's manipulation began. What started as a simple blog about my experience has grown into a comprehensive resource center that provides education, support, and practical tools for people who suspect they might be victims of medical abuse or intimate partner violence involving healthcare knowledge. The Foundation's most popular resource is our comprehensive guide to documenting suspected abuse using modern technology. We provide detailed instructions for safely installing hidden cameras, secure cloud storage options, and legal guidance about evidence collection. The guide has been downloaded over 50,000 times, and we regularly receive messages from people who credit it with helping them escape dangerous situations or gather evidence that led to successful prosecutions. Working with Carol Thornton, Margaret's daughter, we've also developed training materials for healthcare professionals about recognizing signs of medical abuse. Too many cases go undetected because doctors and nurses don't know what to look for when a patient's condition seems inconsistent with their medical history. Our workshops have reached hundreds of healthcare workers across the Pacific Northwest, and we're expanding the program nationally. The most rewarding aspect of this work is the direct support we provide to survivors. Our confidential helpline receives calls from people in situations ranging from subtle medication tampering to obvious poisoning attempts. Each story is unique, but the patterns are disturbingly familiar. Trusted partners using their medical knowledge as weapons, isolation disguised as care, and systematic undermining of the victim's perception of reality. Sarah Martinez joined our team 6 months ago as our first full-time victim advocate. She's a former emergency room nurse who survived an abusive marriage to a paramedic who used his medical knowledge to control and harm her. Her combination of medical expertise and personal experience makes her invaluable in helping callers understand their situations and develop safety plans. We've documented over 200 cases of suspected medical abuse through our helpline, resulting in 43 successful prosecutions and countless victims escaping dangerous relationships. Each case validates the importance of our work and reminds me why I chose to transform my trauma into action, rather than letting it define my future. The psychological scars from David's betrayal haven't completely healed, and Dr. Hawkins reminds me they may never fully disappear. I still experience anxiety in medical settings and remain hypervigilant about anyone who shows excessive interest in my health or well-being. But these responses no longer control my life or prevent me from forming meaningful relationships. 6 months ago, I began dating again, something I never thought would be possible. James is a high school teacher who knows my full story and understands why trust comes slowly for me. Our relationship is built on transparency and patience, qualities that feel revolutionary after years, with someone who weaponized intimacy and care. James has never once suggested taking care of me when I'm sick or preparing my medications, understanding that these gestures would trigger memories I'm still processing. The legal aftermath of David's crimes continues to unfold. 3 additional murder charges were filed against him, as investigators uncovered more evidence of his victims during various clinical rotations. Margaret Thornton's case resulted in a murder conviction, and 2 other families received answers about deaths they'd attributed to medical complications. David will never be eligible for parole, ensuring that he can never harm another vulnerable person. The civil lawsuit against the nursing program and hospital where David trained was settled last year, resulting in comprehensive policy changes about student supervision and background screening. While money couldn't undo the harm he caused, the settlement provided funding for victim services and helped establish protocols that might prevent similar situations in the future. My design business has evolved to focus primarily on creating materials for nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups. The work feels more meaningful than the commercial projects I once pursued, and my experience as a survivor gives me unique insight into communicating about difficult topics with sensitivity and impact. Several domestic violence organizations now use graphics and websites I've created to reach victims who might not otherwise seek help. The hidden cameras that saved my life sit in a place of honor in my home office, reminders of the courage I found when everything seemed hopeless. They represent the moment I chose to trust my instincts, despite being systematically conditioned to doubt my own perceptions. That decision to seek truth rather than accept comfortable lies changed everything that followed. Detective Rodriguez has become a close friend and frequent collaborator on cases involving suspected medical abuse. She often refers victims to our foundation and has testified at several conferences about the investigative challenges these cases present. Her expertise combined with our survivor perspective creates a powerful partnership for education and awareness. The question I'm asked most frequently is whether I regret marrying David or wish I could erase the entire experience. The answer is complicated because while I wouldn't choose to endure systematic poisoning and betrayal, those experiences led to work that has helped hundreds of people escape similar situations. My suffering had meaning because I chose to transform it into action that protects others. Looking toward the future, our foundation is developing partnerships with technology companies to create even more sophisticated tools for documenting abuse safely. We're also working on legislation that would require specific training about medical abuse for all healthcare providers and law enforcement officers. The woman who once lay helpless in her own bed while being slowly poisoned now speaks at national conferences, trains professionals, and provides hope to people trapped in situations that seem impossible to escape. My voice, which David tried to silence through confusion and dependence, now reaches thousands of people who need to know they're not crazy, they're not alone, and there is a way out. The cameras revealed the truth that set me free, but courage and community transformed that truth into a force for change. Every person we help escape a dangerous situation, every healthcare worker we train to recognize abuse, every victim who finds their voice through our support represents proof that survival can become something greater than just staying alive. David took many things from me, but he couldn't destroy my determination to ensure that no one else would suffer what I endured in silence and confusion. That determination has become my greatest strength and my most important legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.